All right, you ready to get going? You want to use the microphone?
Sure. My voice isn't that loud. I'm just stand next to you so you don't have to take it off.
There we go.
Got it on there. You good? Hi, everyone. Oh, that's loud. Hello. I have an announcement for another field trip that was actually suggested by one of your peers. So it is UW-Madison will be hosting the award-winning social media expert, international journalist, and global women's empowerment leader, Jensine Larson, on November 14th, 7 p.m. at Memorial Union for a keynote address. UW-Madison alum herself, who majored in comparative international studies, Jensine Larson founded the social action network World Pulse, a community that connects over 60,000 women and allies in 190 countries worldwide, facilitating women and allies to become citizen journalists. This grassroots community raises the global voice of women and equips women to be local agents of change. And this is by the student organization She's the First, which is on campus that promotes the education and empowerment of women in developing nations. So again, November 14th, 7 p.m. in Memorial Union. And if you have questions, you can direct them to section 302, Molly. Thank you.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Can you hear me all right? A little more? Oops. That's fine. Alrighty. So we're going to get started today, and the title of my lecture is The Human Microbiome. So as you probably learned from the pre-lecture activity, we're going to be talking about how bacteria and the microbes that live on you really positively affect your health, and we can use them as potential therapies in the future. But before I get into my lecture per se, I would like to talk a little bit about how I became a scientist and what I've done to get where I am. So as Stephanie said last week, that scientists love to ask the question why. So the first time I remember ever thinking like why something happens as opposed to just being content with it was due to my brother, John here. He's 3 years younger than I, and he is the recipient of a really rare and abnormal genetic defect that manifests itself in some really bizarre behaviors. So my brother has like true extreme ADHD. He couldn't cook a meal to save his life, like he could literally starve in a house full of food. And for whatever reason, he always talks in question form, and he has like no inner monologue. And they're always really like mundane questions, like if we tell him we're gonna have spaghetti, he'll ask us 100 times before dinner that are we still having spaghetti? Is it spaghetti time? And it drives people crazy, but in the same sense, like even though he has these weird deficiencies, he is really smart in other areas. So he has a photographic memory, and then he also is an exceptional people person. Like he loves to interact with strangers, like no fear whatsoever. He always communicates with people and he can get them to smile, and it's not like the same set of routine things. He's always able to like figure out what exactly he needs to say to get someone to smile. Like one time we took him on a cruise ship. There were like 2,000 people on this boat. By the end of the week, he introduced himself and befriended 1,000 people. It was insane. It was like if you didn't know, if like an independent observer came in at the end of the cruise ship, it would have seemed like we convened this in his honor. Like, so it's like, I remember at a very young age thinking like, what is going on in this person's head that he like couldn't cook a meal to save his life, but he is like so awesome at communicating with people. Like if he had his act any more together, he would be like the world's most terrifying car salesman. So that's why I got into science. So I did my chemistry undergrad at Michigan Tech University in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan here. And at that time, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I did a few internships. The first one I did was a chemistry internship where we purified copper from scrap metal. I found it insanely boring. And so I learned from that even though I don't know what I want to do with my life, it definitely isn't that. So I got another internship at a pharmaceutical company called Pfizer, where I played around with a machine that emulated a sense of human taste. And I found that really interesting, so I was like, all right, well, I think I want to go into biological-related sciences. And that's how I ended up here in Madison working on my pharmacology PhD. And in between my 2 stints of school, I spent a year teaching at the elementary and high school level through the AmeriCorps volunteer program. Alrighty, so let's get back to the lecture at hand. So in the past 10 years, scientists have begun to uncover some really bizarre set of stories. So every time I read a paper that's associated with the human microbiome, I'm simultaneously filled with a sense of disgust at what actually is happening, and which is conflicted with a sense of amazement. And when these products start to come to, is it a little too loud? Or is the lights a little dim? Let's try that one. A little too dark. Video dim. There we go. Is that better? Alrighty. So people are working on some really bizarre type of therapies. So you're going to have some really weird conversations with your doctors in the future with some things that we would consider relegated to current like sci-fi fiction novels or something like that. So to start off this lecture, I would like to ask you guys a question of what therapy do you think is least likely to occur? So in A, we have at the end of a dentist visit, you will be offered a mouthwash where the active ingredient is a bacteria that will prevent you from getting cavities. So then we have B, which is you will be able to reduce the amount of weight that you gain from eating junk food by taking a pill that alters your gut microbiome. C, doctors will be able to effectively prevent any future cases of bladder or urinary tract infections in individuals. D, before undergoing certain types of chemotherapy, your doctor will alter your microbiome to reduce the negative side effects that you experience from chemotherapy. And E, doctors will be able to prevent most of the symptoms associated with lactose intolerance by altering the microbiome in the gut of these individuals with just a 10-minute procedure so that the symptoms that they experience are strongly reduced almost to zero. So who thinks that A is the most unlikely activity, just with a quick show of hands? No one? All right, one person. How about B? B, a lot more. All right, about 20. C? Yeah, about half, a little bit about the same as B. How about D? About 5. 10, and then E. Alrighty, so the most people answered B here, that you'll be able to take a pill that reduces the amount of weight that you gain from eating junk food. And that actually is one of the most solid ones. And the people are actively working on this. They have these bacterial supplements in like phase 1 and 2 clinical trials. So this actually could be something that's going to happen in the future, that your lifetime. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just wanted to put this slide up here to highlight how the future of medicine is going to start to get really weird, and you're going to be having some really bizarre conversations with your doctors in your lifetime. So the take-home messages from this lecture are fourfold. I'll just put them up right away. The first is that bacteria affect virtually every system in your body. There's an astounding array of things that bacteria have been implicated in terms of altering our health. And the second one is that your body is part of an ecosystem for bacteria. The third being that human and bacterial relationships are mostly positive. A lot of times in the news, we hear a lot about the negative sides of that, how bacteria get us sick. But today we're focusing on the positive relationship between human and bacteria. And the fourth one, the most important, and the only reason why I feel compelled to tell you this story today is because that changes to your microbiome can significantly change your health. All right, so before we get into what the microbiome is and some interesting facts about it, I'd like to first take a second and talk about what bacteria are, so we're all on the same level here. So bacteria is really a catch-all term. It doesn't represent a small section of species, but a very large one. So to highlight that point here, I've put up what we call a phylogenetic tree of life, where scientists have tried to show the relationship of all living organisms on Earth. And so they tried to break all living organisms into 3 large categories. So you can imagine these are going to be generally very non-specific things. So humans would be here in the animals section of the eukaryota group. And this eukaryota group also contains things like all the plants, all fungi, and even slime mold. Now, if you're anything like myself, you're thinking, well, what do I have in common with the slime mold? And it's really not relevant to the lecture, it's just how our cells are organized. But moving on to the bacteria, we see that it's also its own large section. And really what I want you to take home from this slide is that there are some bacteria that are as related to each other as we are to slime molds, which is to say that maybe they're completely different on many facets. So when you think of bacteria, it's not just one type of thing, it's a huge class of things. And then from some of your questions in the pre-lecture, I decided to add in a little bit of a slide here for terminology. So bacteria are what we call microorganisms, just being small organisms. And so if we represent all the microorganisms as like a Venn diagram, bacteria are a small section inside of that. And also we can call microorganisms microbes. People use those terms interchangeably. And some bacteria cause human sickness, and so we'd call those pathogenic sickness or disease-causing bacteria. And some are non-pathogenic, meaning that they don't cause disease. So what we're talking about here in today's lecture is the non-pathogenic bacteria. And in the discussion activity today, we'll switch gears and focus on pathogenic bacteria to give you guys a complete picture of a representation of kind of how bacteria interact with humans. So bacteria are very small unicellular organisms. So bacteria lengths range from anywhere to 0.2 to 5 microns in length, a micron just being a meter divided into 1,000,000 equal parts. Now, just thinking about what 1/1,000,000th of a meter is isn't too helpful to me, so I like to put things into perspective. So let's relate it to a human hair. So the average diameter of a human hair is 100 microns. So we can just ask the question, how many bacteria would it take to go from one end of a human hair to the other? And that ranges anywhere from 500 to 20. So I'd just like you to take a second and look at a piece of hair on your arm or on the back of the head of the person in front of you and think to yourself, it would take anywhere from 20 to 500 bacteria to go from one end of that hair to the other. So that's the scale of the world that we're considering today. It's infinitesimally tiny, and for the majority of human history, we had no idea that this world existed. Additionally, they're unicellular, meaning that they are comprised of just one cell. So here we go. We have an electron micrograph picture of a single E. coli cell. We have its single body here, and then it has these things called flagella that it uses to swim around in its environment. And so we know what is inside of these things, moving to more of a textbook diagram. So if we look inside, they have DNA, proteins, and water. And that's really the main constituent of what bacteria are filled with. And really, these things can be thought of as self-replicating, mindless robots. So it sounds a little bizarre, but they're mindless because we know they have no nervous system, they have no brain, so they don't have any conscious thought. They don't worry about where the next meal is coming from, how they're going to do in the next midterm, stuff like that. They only really have one goal, and it's called the biological imperative. And this one goal is to get enough energy to reproduce. That's the main thing that they're concerned with. And that's actually true for the majority of things that we would classify as alive. And the reason I think that they could be kind of described as robots is because all of their actions are dictated by proteins that are expressed by their genome. So how they decide to swim and where they decide to swim is completely dictated by an array of proteins that just basically act as small programs, just saying, go forward, there's food here, or go away, there's toxins here, stuff like that. So all of those proteins are not alive, but when they all come together and act in unison, we would consider that process life. So here I have a video of E. coli swimming around. So this process here that we see of things moving around is completely responsible to a bunch of protein-protein interactions, all mindless, And they're all just basically moving because of how these proteins dictate. And then to represent some of the heterogeneity in the bacteria world, I'd also like to show this video of Proteus mirabilis, which moves very differently, kind of disturbing in my opinion. They kind of move forward like a snake. And so each of these black dots here is an individual cell body, and they get together and form like a really weird conga line and move back and forth. And so this kind of does a good job of highlighting how different bacteria move and the heterogeneity of what bacteria really are. All right, so that's the intro that I wanted to give on what bacteria are. So let's move on to some microbiome stuff and discuss how bacteria live on us. So all of these facts I find gross and pretty reprehensible, right? So the first one, humans have 5 pounds of living bacteria on us. So when class convened at like 225, collectively we also all brought in here 1,000 pounds of bacteria, right? That's gross. And additionally, each of us has thousands of species of bacteria living on us right now. So this number, we don't have a good estimate of it. That's why I kind of left it vague in the thousands. But we keep on finding more and more species of bacteria that are living on us. And to put this into perspective, there are more species of bacteria living on you right now than there are species of birds that are alive in North America. And I mean that like in the continental sense, so Canada, US, and Mexico. Right? It's ridiculous. There are apparently like 100 or hundreds of bacteria that just live in your belly button alone. So it's also weird because bacterial cells outnumber your human cells by a factor of 10 to 1. So if all of us are part of, each of us represent a cell for some human, like there's about 200 of us in the room, that means that only 20 of us would be human cells. So like all the people in the first row, you guys are all human cells, and everyone else would be a bacterial cell. That's an accurate representation of what's happening in your body right now if you tried to compare the cells. Just weird, right? And when I think of myself, like going through my day-to-day activities, I like to think of myself as like Joe the human, doing human things. But this kind of implies that like I'm some sort of human microbe superorganism hybrid thing. Like, what does that even mean? It's ridiculous. And then the final point, and the one that's really important for medical applications and therapies, is that the bacterial genes outnumber your human genes by an order of 100 to 1. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when I hear these facts, I get really skeeved out, and I feel like I am just infested with bacteria. And while it's kind of true, it's not really a true infestation like we normally think of here. So here I've included a picture of a rabbit infestation in Australia. Someone introduced some rabbits into Australia way back in the day. They don't have any natural predators, and they just grew to epidemic proportions. So here's a field, and I'm not sure how clear it is, that there's just basically hundreds of rabbits living in this field. They're completely taken over the ecosystem. They're eating all the native plants, outcompeting the other animals. So this is not a good representation of what the bacteria living on you are doing. So I tried to find a picture of something that represents a species in balance with its ecosystem. It was kind of hard to find one that was really appropriate for rabbits. So I tried to find a picture of a cute rabbit doing cute rabbit things, living in, harmony with its environment. So that's really what that's tried to represent there. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that human and bacterial interactions are what we would call commensal, meaning that they're win-win, that we get something positive from it and they get something positive from it. Oh yeah. So we can start to explore a little bit more of how bacteria actually live on us. So here we have a textbook representation of a cross-section of skin. So the top layer here is the skin surface, and then you have a few layers of dead skin, and then here we have some living tissue, the epidermis, the dermis. And all of these blue and red things are microbes. So this is like, a representation of the microbes that live on your skin. And we see they're randomly distributed on top. Some have even made their way into the different layers of dead skin cells that you have. And what's especially disturbing about this slide is that they've made their way into all of the sweat glands, and all the way down into your hair shafts, like to the root of it. So this is happening with every sweat gland you have on your body and every hair follicle you have, right? That's disturbing. And this kind of also serves to highlight why it's so hard to get rid of bacteria. So I could wash my hands, like at the front of the building here, there's that antimicrobial alcohol spray that you can use that kills 99.9% of bacteria or something like that. Well, if you apply that, basically, it's just going to rub it over the skin, maybe kill those bacteria, but you still have this huge reservoir of bacteria hidden away that's not attacking. So that number of 99.9%, first of all, it's not really accurate because they don't take into account all of this bacteria, which is a huge proportion. And that's why after you wash your hands, so if you used it when you came into lecture today, bacteria live for about 20 minutes or so. So by the end of the class period today, you'll be back to this healthy state of bacteria growing all amok in your skin. But we don't have to just keep ourselves in the textbook format. We actually have some real pictures of this, if my computer decides to move forward. There we go. So this is an electron micrograph where we've zoomed in on a piece of skin. So each of these flakes here is a skin cell, and we have a hair follicle. And each of these red dots are artificially colored, and they're just bacteria, and they're just artificially colored so it's easier to see. So this is a good representation of what actually is happening if you could actually see microbes living on your skin. So it turns out that different areas on your body aren't all the same. And we can think of each part of your body as a different ecosystem, right? Just so that we know that there are deserts, there are rainforests, and those cause different types of organisms to live in those environments. The same thing can be true for all the regions on your body. So in this graph here that I'm showing you, even though there are thousands of bacterial species that live on your body, we can classify them into 6 groups. For the purposes of this class, I won't ask you to remember what those are, just to know that there are just 6 groups. And these do a really good job of classifying the general variation between the different microbial ecosystems on your body. So we can see the ear canal has this pie chart that's mostly comprised of firmicutes and actinobacteria, and this is different from the environment that's on your hair or in your mouth. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because you can imagine that your mouth is a lot wetter, it's a lot more increased temperature than on your hair, so different bacteria or organisms would be better suited to live in one environment or the other. All right, so very generally, bacteria and all organisms, I guess in general, need 3 things to live. They need an appropriate food source, they need some amount of water, and they need the right environment, right? They need it to be not too hot, not too cold, right temperature, right humidity, pH, stuff like that. So I'd like you guys to take a second and discuss among your groups what these constituents might be, the food, water, and water levels, and the permissive environment, for bacteria that have specialized and evolved to live in these different ecosystems. So I'll let you guys chat for a few minutes, and then we'll see if anyone wants to share their answers. So what are you guys thinking for the throat? Like, what would constitute food for bacteria that live in the throat? Whatever you eat? Yeah? For sure.
Air you inhale.
What'd you say?
Air you inhale.
Yeah, for sure. And you think it's going to be like how would you describe the environment that they need to live? Yep. Sweet. Awesome. Alrighty, I'm seeing some people start to pull out phones, so I'll take that as a signal that you guys have discussed this in thoroughness and we're starting to move on. So would anyone care to share what they thought counted as food for bacteria that have evolved to live in their respective area? And we haven't covered this specifically yet, so I'm just looking for general speculation. How about the group that had bacteria that live in the mouth? What would you guys say? Wherever. Yeah.
That saliva is something we live in, and also all the nutrients that we consume.
Yeah, definitely. So she said that the bacteria could potentially eat some of the or consume some of the saliva that we have. Saliva contains a small amount of proteins, ions, stuff like that. And then additionally, we go out of our way 3 times a day to shove food in our face. So basically, bacteria just have to hold on for the ride, and we do all the work for them. So they just eat a little bit of our food, leaving the majority of it for us. And it's, again, this win-win type of scenario. So let's go with a harder one. How about the group that had eyes? What do you think would count for food for bacteria that live in your eyes? And I'm actually talking like on the white of your eyes, like in between your eyelid and your eye, which is weird to think that bacteria have evolved to live there. Bizarre. So what do you guys think? I don't know where section 309 is. Yeah? You guys come up with any guesses? Because I'm not too sure I could come up with like the right answer off the top of my head. So I'm just looking for some general speculation. So what do we generally find in the eye? So there's some sort of like fluid material. Salt. So they can get some stuff from that. But they still need an energy source. So you guys have so this is kind of a tough one. I would say that your eyes, like the tears and stuff like that aren't completely composed of water. They have a little bit of like protein and stuff like that. So maybe they like dissolve some of our wasted protein. How about the group that had skin as their one? What do you guys think that food would be for bacteria that's evolved to live on your skin for section 306? Yeah?
We talked about how they could consume dead skin cells.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, it's kind of like we have our own cleaning crew that lives on us. And so if we can go back to this slide of the textbook example of bacteria on skin. My computer doesn't have a fit. We have this uneasy truce with these bacteria. So they've evolved, and we've evolved, to allow them to live on the surface of our skin, and they never cross this barrier into our living body. That's when we would activate our immune system to fight those things off. So that we basically give them free rent and board, allowing them to eat like our dead cells. And as long as they don't cross this barrier, everyone's happy, which is really weird to kind of think about. All right. So excellent. So let's move on to how does the microbiome vary between individuals? So here I'm just showing another Venn diagram. So this diagram represents all the different species of bacteria that live in a person. We call it a microbiome. And we compare that to a second person, person B. We find that they don't overlap completely, that there is some overlap. And we've started to call these the core set of microbes that everyone has. But what's really interesting is that there's a little bit of difference from every person. And so far from the studies that we've done, we haven't really found 2 people that have identical microbiomes. So this raises a big question of why is everyone's microbiome so different? You could imagine that maybe it's changed by who you interact with. So like if bacteria is living on my skin and I use my dictator-like powers as a teacher to force someone to give me a high five, was that some sort of weird bacterial communication event that I somehow got infected with your bacteria and vice versa? So there's all these open questions about how does bacteria grow and live on one person but seemingly not on another. So this is an area that people are trying to figure out. And there's two hypotheses about this that could explain this fact. The first is that these microbiomes function similarly, right? They're composed of a bunch of different species, but they're basically acting in the same way, that they do all the same things in person A that they could in person B. So what do I mean by this? So here I'm just showing a graph of all the rainforests in the world. There's a rainforest in South America, Africa, and South Asia. So all of these are rainforests. They're all ecosystems that could be comprised or kind of described very similarly. And even though they don't have the same species, all those species kind of act very similarly. So here I just have an example of 3 large cats. And even though they're different species, they kind of fill the same role in the ecosystem, right? They're basically alpha predators. So this is what we mean by maybe they function separately. They're different species, but they're kind of similar, right? These are all rainforests, and they're kind of doing the same thing, even though they're comprised of different species. However, what we've found, and that's definitely true for some people here, like someone might have a microbiome, and then another person in here might have a different one, and they're pretty much identical in terms of the benefits they provide you. But what we've found for a group of people, and for a majority of them, is that these microbiomes do indeed function very differently, and these have huge ramifications for your health. So let's start to get into what we get out of having this bacterial-human relationship. So we've talked in the first section about what the bacteria get out of this, and I said that this is a win-win, so we're also getting something positive from this. So I'd like you guys to discuss in your sections what we are getting out of it. So I haven't really introduced anything specifically, so feel free to wildly speculate about just general things or specifics if you want to come up with them. I've covered some of them in the very beginning in the first slide that I showed, and then also in the pre-lecture video that I showed you guys, had some ideas. So I'd like you guys just to take a few minutes and discuss some of those, and I'll call on some participants. How's it going? Good. Oh, no problem. Did you guys have to look up a lot of specific science words and stuff? Okay. How does that work? Because there's not specific signs for new science words, so you just have to spell it out.
Sometimes when I spell them, it's very specific. Otherwise, there's a way to show any concept in any language. It just might be a different economy of words. So you might have one word, but it takes us 5 to 10 signs to communicate that word. But
I see.
there's a lot of ways of doing it.
Okay. Cool. Alrighty, guys, let's get back together. So would anyone care to share some wild speculations that they come up with, or some of the positive things that we get out of having a gross amount of bacteria living on us and in us at all times throughout our life? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So studies have definitely, he said that bacteria help boost our immune system, and that's definitely true. And they found that if you live in too clean of an environment, that you are more likely to get asthma later on in life. And so one of the strong hypotheses that people have is maybe you weren't exposed to enough microbes and dirt from a young age to get a nice healthy microbiome, and that this can alter your susceptibility to asthma. How about something else? Yeah? Yep, they definitely aid in digestion. That's an excellent point. Anything else? Looking for one more. Yeah.
I guess this one's kind of weird, but I thought since they contribute to our odor, technically could it help us like find a mate because of like pheromones and stuff? No.
Yeah, I like it. So if everyone didn't hear, bacteria, she hypothesized that bacteria can help participate in our odor, and certain people choose mates based on odor, at least definitely a certain species. And we've never found a human pheromone that's completely responsible for attraction, at least like identified the exact molecule. But potentially one could speculate that this might change your susceptibility to mates. I mean, maybe only in a negative way. If you feel that a person smells really bad, you're less likely to mate with them. All right. So excellent. So you guys came up with a good list of things. And what I want to talk about for the remaining lecture is just 4 examples, just how it's microbiome. A healthy microbiome is necessary for you to maintain a good basal level of health. So we've done some studies where we raise mice in completely sterile environments, so they don't have any microbes on them or in them at all. And we found that pretty much in every capacity that we can look at that relates to their health, they are deficient. They weigh less, they're less able to get energy from food, they're more likely to die sooner. When they are exposed to pathogens, they're more likely to get sick. The list just goes on, and it really highlights that we have evolved to have this layer of bacteria on us at all times, and they're really crucial to make sure that we are living a healthy life. And then this one was mentioned previously, that they allow us to get additional calories from food. So I think this one is really neat, so I'd like to go into it a little bit more. So of all the food that we eat, the majority of it's digestible, but there's actually a significant portion that is non-digestible to us. So instead of this just passing through in a really disgusting, weird tour of our colon, the gut microbiome that we have inside of us consumes this. And what they do is they'll take this non-digestible material and get some energy from it so that they can live and thrive. And then what they'll do is they turn some of that non-digestible material into digestible material. So then we can get more energy from that food. So what they've found is that different people have different amounts of bacteria that are either good at this or very bad at this. So when scientists were doing these studies, they found a really interesting correlation. That if you have this one group of more firmisuits that are bad at this process, then in general, you had a lower body weight than people who had more of these bacteria groups called bacteriodetes that are very good at this process. And it kind of makes sense, right? If I eat a potato and I have a lot of bacteriodetes that are very good at converting more of that energy into digestible material, it's like the equivalent that I ate 3 potatoes. So we know that there's already a lot of factors involved with weight gain, right? It's like how much food you eat, what type of food you eat, do you work out, do you have a genetic predisposition to it, do you drink, do you smoke, are you stressed out? Stuff like that really strongly affects this. So we're not saying that this is like the huge factor that's going to be like the cure-all for potentially changing obesity, but it is definitely another piece to the puzzle. And so when scientists made this correlation or this observation, they weren't really sure what the effect was. Was it really that these different microbiomes were altering how much people weighed? Or there's so many other variables and factors that it's basically kind of occluded, right? That you couldn't really make this statement that this different microbiome was indeed causing an increase in weight. So they did an experiment where they basically said that if it is true that bacteria are altering our susceptibility to weight, if we transfer the gut microbiomes from humans into microbe-free mice, the ones with more bacteriodetes that are very good at getting more calories from food should over time gain more weight than those that don't. So they did this gut microbiome transplant and waited a period of time, and they indeed found that the mice that got the bacteriodet-rich gut microbiome indeed became significantly more obese than the counterparts that didn't. And what was surprising is that if you correlate this weight gain to a human level, it turns out to be like 10 or 15 pounds of weight that was caused by having this different gut microbiome. And this is a really nice experiment because they still controlled the amount of food they ate, the same environment, same water intake, and these things are really strongly related, so there's not that much of a genetic difference. So this is really strong evidence to show that different microbiomes that people have can strongly affect how much weight you gain. And we kind of know that this is true, right? There are certain people who can eat junk food all the time and they never gain weight. And there are other people that so much look as a French fry and they just like bloat up by 10 pounds. And so a lot of times we've wondered why, and we definitely know that that's probably related to your human genetics, but now we know that it's also related to your microbiome genetics, or the genetics of the bacteria in you. And what's really interesting is that it's actually pretty easy to change these microbiomes. So it's not too much of a stretch of imagination to say that some company in the future might start to offer treatments where they switch out these bad bacteria for these good ones so you have a more lean and healthy environment. Or alternatively, if you're in a non-industrialized nation where food is really scarce, maybe you want more of these because if food's really scarce, you want to get the most energy from it. So we can start to think about using microbiomes as a way to improve human health. Alrighty. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is that they help synthesize essential vitamins. So here I just listed 2, vitamins B and vitamins K. And then the last thing I'd like to go in more is about how they change your susceptibility to diseases. So there's a surprising list of things that we used to think that some people are just lucky or unlucky with how their health is going to be in the future. One of them is cavities. Some people, like I have some friends that are dentists, and they say that they see people who brush, floss, and mouthwash 3 times a day, and their teeth are practically rotting out of their face, and that other people like barely take care of their mouth at all, and they have never had a cavity in their life. So we always used to think that maybe it's something due to your human genetics, but studies have recently uncovered that there are certain types of bacteria that you can have in your mouth that produce a lot more acid than others. So basically for the people that have this type of bacteria, it's like they're drinking pop all the time, every day, even when they're sleeping, causing more cavities. So this group did a study where they switched this bad bacteria that causes cavities with good ones, and they're basically waiting the results. So it's only been out, the study's like for 1 year, so it's not a long enough time to really say how conclusive this is going to be. But it's really interesting to think, as there are some people that definitely don't get cavities in their lifetime. If it's attributable to a microbiome, we could finally take down like big Colgate and big teeth industry and not have to brush again. And the same thing with bladder and urinary infections, same type of logic. There are some microbiomes that people have that are more susceptible to getting these. Other people will never get them in their life. And so there are companies that have been looking for people that never get these types of infections, seeing what microbiomes they have, and are trying to do these types of transplants to effectively potentially cure these types of infections. And the same with lactose intolerance. From Stephanie's lecture, we know that some people have severe gastrointestinal distress from consuming lactose. Other people have very minimal symptoms. And that's actually due to differences of the microbiome you have in your gut. So you could imagine also switching that out. So you could easily consume lactose-containing products without having any of the negative symptoms, regardless of your human genetics and how they play a factor. And additionally, studies have come out with things that are inside of our body, like cholesterol levels and stuff like that, that are also involved. So the last example I want to go through is starting to focus on how we can use microbiome changes as medical treatments. So here I want to focus in on an interesting aspect that relates antibiotic use with gut microbiome and how that can cause diseases. And I added this in because some of the questions I got from the pre-lecture. So there's this microbe called Clostridium difficile, and it causes infections in about 14,000 people per year in the US, or 14,000 deaths. So it turns out that 1 out of 200 people carry this bacteria in their gut. So statistically, one of us right now has this in our gut, and it's not causing any issues because we have a healthy microbiome in our gut, and so we have a very small percentage of it being this Clostridium difficile because it can't really outcompete in this healthy ecosystem. But if that person gets sick and is given a wide spectrum antibiotic, which kills a significant percentage of the bacteria in the gut, like 99.9%, what it's found is that C. diff is able to grow back first and more quickly. So when someone gets this antibiotic treatment, they go from a healthy ecosystem of many species of bacteria to primarily C. diff. And when C. diff gets to high enough concentrations, it releases a toxin that causes you to have diarrhea 3 times a day until you die. So it's pretty brutal. So we have a few treatment options for this. And the first that we've basically been doing is computer. It's just giving people more antibiotics, right? So if you have too many bugs in your stomach that are causing sickness, well, we know how to kill them, just give you more antibiotics. But you can clearly see this just creates a cycle, that if you reduce the gut microbiome, you're just gonna be back here, and then when you stop taking them, the C. diff's gonna grow back, and you're back experiencing life-threatening symptoms. So I talked to an individual that had this case, and they said that their life was basically hell. Like if they ever ran out of medicine, they couldn't leave the house. Like they would have to depend on their wife to go get the medicine for them. And the medicine that we would give them is very expensive. So they had this huge bill, and they were thinking that they're gonna have to just pay this amount of money for the rest of their life. So this clearly is a way to mitigate symptoms, but it's not really a cure. Like we haven't cured the disease. So what people have started to do, scientists at least, and doctors, is that they'll give the person an antibiotic to knock down the gut microbiome, and then they'll supplement them with a fecal transplant. Now this is ridiculously gross, and I don't know who came up with it the first time around, but someone hypothesized that if someone has a healthy microbiome, we should just transfer the microbiome of the healthy person into the sick person. So current protocols in the hospital say that you should usually get this from someone that's closely related to you, like your wife or someone that you live with. So it kind of makes for some very awkward conversations. But this is the cure. So the person that I told you before who described his life as hell, he said that he got this procedure, and although it was very disconcerting and uncomfortable, that it worked. Like within 10 minutes, he was able to leave the hospital, no negative symptoms, and he was cured. Like he didn't have to have any issues, there was no incubation. It's just like, you're done, all right. You're free to live your life with no medication again. So this definitely is the cure for this, but it simultaneously is one of the most gross and weird things that we're starting to do in medicine. So I don't know about you guys, but when I envisioned cutting edge 21st century medical technology, it didn't involve taking poo from person A and transferring it to person B. Like whoever had this idea first, like if there were 2 doctors and they're like, hey, you know that guy that's really sick with diarrhea? I bet we could cure him by transferring feces from another person into him. It's a great idea. Like, how did this ever get to this point? So, all these diseases that I talked about previously, the cavities, the bladder infections, the lactose intolerance, can all be potentially treated with microbiome changes. So some of the big things in the field that people have been doing is to figure out how to make it less gross. So if some of you guys just learned about fecal transplants, we've already started to move away from that phase where someone had a brilliant idea of just purifying the bacteria out of it, making it into a pill that you could swallow. And so the abstract for that story was kind of funny because they had to state multiple times that no one vomited or had any negative taste symptoms from basically consuming something that came out of a stool sample. And so there's some potential issues with changing microbiomes. So we're trying to figure out what species can support a healthy ecosystem. So we're basically just changing things willy-nilly. We're like, all right, we don't want this leopard in here anymore. Let's replace it with a tiger. And maybe in certain situations that's appropriate, but what if we didn't really understand the species we're introducing and we replaced this cat with this one? You could easily imagine that a rainforest ecosystem would be thrown out of whack, and in the same way we could imagine that if we put the wrong bacteria in you, that it could cause unforeseen issues. And the second one is that we're kind of assuming that each environment is amenable to the same bacteria, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe you have a certain genetics that cause your pH in your mouth, the saliva, to be slightly different than someone else, and that one person's microbiome isn't truly compatible with another. So I have 2 more slides, and they shouldn't take too long. We can let you guys go. So I wanted to address the question of why are we finding out about this now? And it's completely due to new sequencing technology. So I have this video of this professor who's going to talk a little bit about that.
The only way that we can really look at the human microbiome is through modern genetic tools. We basically take the samples that represent the human microbiome. So we take samples from the respiratory tract, take samples from the skin, we take samples from the gastrointestinal tract, and other areas like that. And we take all of the DNA or the RNA that's present in that sample, and we do genetic sequencing on all of it. And then we use supercomputers to then find out what all those little pieces of DNA represent, and that through that process we're able to get a complete picture of what the microbiome is in any part of the human body.
Alrighty. So basically we have this improved ability to read DNA, and so before we knew that a bunch of bacteria lived on us, but we had no idea of the diversity of it. And so he was talking about how we have these new machines, and they showed one of them. It's worth about $500,000 that's used to do this type of research. So I'd like to close my lecture just highlighting potential careers in microbiome-related research if you're interested. So this is a multidisciplinary science, and there's a lot of different facets from it. So if you are interested in studying the bacteria themselves, you could get a microbiology degree. If you're interested more in figuring out how these sequencing machines work and the technology behind them, you can get involved with biochemistry. And additionally, we've been having to write a lot of computer programs and methods for computers to analyze the massive amount of data we're producing. That's called bioinformatics. And additionally, if you're interested in studying the human aspects of these diseases, you can get into the various medical sciences. So with that, I'd just like to say for your cards, I would like you guys to write what was either really confusing about this lecture, because it's the second time I've given it, and I made some tweaks, and I'm always looking to improve it. So if there's a concept that I kind of explained too quickly, or that didn't make a lot of sense, I'd appreciate it. Or alternatively, something that you thought was relatively strong, or something that you learned from this lecture. So you can just write those, and then turn them into your peer mentor. And with that, we can go on to discussion. Yeah, no problem at all.